In the past few years, President Bush was pushing, we're going to take a little tact here,
Okay.
was pushing for privatization of Social Security and diversifying retirement funds and doing a lot of things that were unpopular. What is your message to the senior citizens in your community as far as what they can hope for as far as bolstering Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, things of that nature, these programs that have been proven to work for years and years? How will you help those programs to keep going and make sure that they have a viable retirement option in their retirement years?
Well, we absolutely have to continue to keep Social Security strong. It was started as a supplemental income program, and it wasn't designed to be a retirement program necessarily, but with so many companies cutting pensions, that it has become by default a retirement program. But we do have an obligation to our seniors, to our parents, to our grandparents, to make sure that we take care of them in their later years as they took care of us. And so that is, I think, a moral obligation that we have to make sure that we're taking care of our seniors.
All right. Well, now we know that you had a thriving business. You still have what was the name of it again?
It's Syscom Services, and then I also, for a number of years when I was in Fort Collins, when my kids were younger, I owned a coffee shop, coffee ice cream sandwich shop in Old Town Fort Collins. And that was a great thing to do when I had younger children at home, because it gave me the flexibility to still be with them. They could walk down to the store after school, make themselves a milkshake. I put them to work behind the counter. So it was a great learning opportunity for my kids, and just a really fun thing to do, to own and grow a small business. I sold
So
it
they
a
got
couple
to
of years
work
ago.
and earn their way through.
They did.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
And it's good to show kids how to start their own businesses and be a part of a business. I think that's probably the best way to equip kids, young people, to be able to function and exceed in the global economy.
Yeah, and the kinds of skills that you need, the kind of work ethic that you need. I remember my son was 5 when I first bought the store, and I gave all my kids punch cards, and they had to punch in when they started working, so I knew how much to give them. I remember my son came down and he said, "Hey Mom, can I punch in and then take my break?" I said, "No, it doesn't work that way. You gotta work a little first before you take a break." But it's a great experience for kids to really see firsthand how a business works and how you manage a budget. Obviously, you can't spend more than you take in. I used to give a lot of free things away to my friends when they came into the store, and my daughter used to chide me and say, "Mom, you can't give away anything. You're never going to make any money that way." So,
you're building brand loyalty.
Good. Good lesson. But so that was also a great thing to do. But I learned lots of things as a small business owner. Number one, that you can't be spending more than you bring in, and that's something I think the federal government has forgotten.
Oh,
We have been a borrow and spend administration, and we're in a huge deficit as a result of that. I'm encouraged by this past Congress has committed to pay-as-you-go policies before any new legislation will be implemented. We have to figure out how it's going to be paid without implementing new taxes, and I think that's a good thing. We absolutely need to get our financial house in order.
And for Republicans that are fiscal conservatives who are scratching their heads wondering what has been going on with the government, it sounds like that you'll have your needs represented up in your district in CD-4. So like Betsy Markey has a strong head on her shoulders in terms of physical knowledge, being a business owner. Now, in terms of political work, I believe I heard you say that you had done some work with Ken Salazar. Could you touch on that briefly?
Yeah, I have. So my background is a mix of government and business experience. I started out actually in the late 1970s. I worked on Capitol Hill, so I understand Congress. I've worked in Washington, D.C., know how the committee system works. I had the opportunity to work for the Treasury Department and the U.S. Department of State, so I've traveled quite a bit visiting our overseas embassies and consulates. I was a computer security specialist, and realize the great work that's being done in our overseas embassies by our Foreign Service officers, and we have pushed that part aside, and we absolutely need to begin to use diplomacy again to fight terrorism and regain our good reputation around the world. So they were a great experience for me.
Sounds like that's a whole new can of worms. So we're going to take a quick break, and I want to hear a lot more about that, your experience there. This is Wade Norris with Betsy Markey here on UP News, Mile High Sports Radio, and we'll be right back. And we're back here on UP News. I'm your host, Wade Norris, here on Mile High Sports Radio. And you can check us out on 1510 AM in Denver and 1570 up in northern Colorado. We're here talking with candidate for CD-4, Betsy Markey, and we were just talking about something that sounded very interesting. You had worked in small business, and you also you've worked with Ken Salazar, but you were talking about some of your experience in Washington before. Touch a little bit more on that, especially your view of diplomacy and dealing with other nations.
Okay. Yes, as I mentioned, I started out, my first love has always been politics, and my master's is in public administration. I always saw myself as being a public administrator, but I did have the opportunity back in the early 1980s. I was in a program called Presidential Management Fellow, where I was working in the federal government, and one of the jobs that I had was to work for the U.S. Department of State, and I was the first director of computer security policy and training, and that's when computers started exploding in business and in government, and it was our job to say, okay, let's take a step back, and the information, let's take a look at the information we are putting on our computers, particularly our unclassified computers, and see if in the aggregate that information could potentially be of interest to foreign governments, and what are the threats and vulnerabilities on our computer system. So what I did was go to our overseas embassies and consulates, and we would do computer security reviews. And I have to say that I think our Foreign Service officers overseas are just second to none, and we have not used their advice. I think during this administration, we have favored the Defense Department over the State Department, and their voice has been louder. And I believe that in the State Department, we absolutely need to utilize the resources that we have overseas, people who are there every day, in that host country, and can do so much to promote peace, to promote a dialogue of understanding. And that is something that I would like to see us get back to, is using the resources of our diplomatic corps.
A lot of our Democratic fans of Dennis Kucinich are big fans of his idea of a Department of Peace. And when I was talking to David Sirota on an earlier segment, he says, well, we already have a Department of Peace. It's called the State Department. And it's not been used, and it's been totally sidestepped during the past 7 years and ignored. And I'm glad to hear that you have high regards for them and knowledge of that State Department.
Right. Yes, and I would agree with David Sirota. We do. That is the purpose of the State Department. Within the State Department is the Agency for International Development, where we can really promote so many good ideas and help and goodwill, which translates into people having a better understanding of the American people and our government. And that is how you stop terrorism. At least that's how you make a dent into it, is to engage other countries in understanding why we are there and how we can help them and how we can be partners in a world community.
Yeah, and unfortunately, in the past 7 years, we've left a vacuum of goodwill. And a lot of people